Boker Tov, everybody. Nice to see you. Thank you. So last week we were discussing, we discussed the idea of preparing for prayer, the mind frame, waiting an hour, the Hasidim Harishonim, and whether the kings or the snakes. You know, you got to ignore everybody. You got to be so focused on your tefillah. It's very hard. Kavanah is a very, very difficult concept for us. And it's just a little last week. And then we talked mainly on Birchat HaTorah. The two or three brachot that we say, that we say that, but in the Talmud, really, we saw that it was different opinions. You know, one said, and so another rabbi said, okay, let's say, and the third rabbi said, let's say, and then Rav Hamanuna, I believe, was the one who said, or is Rav Papa, now I forget, said that, oh, it's so beautiful, let's say them all. Let's say them all, and that's our custom to involve. So we discussed Lasok b'divrei Torah, to be involved in Torah, etc. So we'll continue with that in a moment, but like I've done the last few weeks, I think I just want to start with the general idea of tefillah, unrelated to the exact wording, but an overarching idea. And because of the Birchat HaShavua last week, this week, and I guess the question is why our imahot were akarot. I mentioned last week, I gave a pinch hit at the last minute to give the Parsha Shir. I said the way the Torah introduces, Sarah is like, cruel is not the right word, but it's like, wow, it's like a punch in the gut. But Sarah akara ein lavlad. We know nothing about Sarah. She was barren, had no children, which of course is a repetitive verse. But that's how the Torah does it, because the first 11 chapters, all we read about genealogies. This one had this kid, this one had, not all, but a lot of what we read about. This one had that kid, this one had this kid. So the whole purpose of woman in the first 11 generations was to have children. This part I didn't really discuss, but the Torah comes along and says, no, you can be a matriarch even if you don't have children. You can, in other words, you're great. It's not just to have a children, but the Torah introduces Sarah as an akarat. So the question the Gemara asks, why were all the imahot akarot? So the Gemara gives a very strange answer. Hold on. Gemara gives a really difficult answer. I think the Gemara says that imahot were akarot because God loves the prayers of the righteous. So on the surface, that sounds cruel. I mean, God's going to make people suffer because he wants to hear them pray. What's it, playing games with us? So what does that mean? And of course, and Leah would have been an akarat too, but God had rachmanas on her because it said that Yaakov hated her, so she wasn't an akara, and she had children, but she should have been. That's also a fascinating idea. That's what Torah says. God saw that Leah was hated. However you want to translate the word snua, but it's not a positive word. So because of that, she had children. So what exactly does it mean that God loves the prayers of the righteous, and therefore he basically made Sarah, Rivka, and Rachel, suffer, go through a lot. It was very painful, especially, I mean, it's always painful when you want a child, but especially in the ancient world, and especially Leah's having children and Rachel's getting jealous and all kinds of things. So I think what it means, maybe you have a better explanation, but what I thought it meant, is that the notion of tefillah is to be dependent on God. I think we mentioned this in our first class, the beautiful idea of Rav Soloveitchik, that only a child can pray and only an adult can learn, because a child is total dependence. An infant, really, a baby, knows, they can't do anything on their own. And an adult is very independent. I don't need people. I can figure it out, right? Only a person who's a child who realizes that they need help of others, only such a mindset can daven. And that was the greatness of Sarah. This was said on a beautiful talk on Sarah, that Sarah was 7 and 20 and 100 at the same time, right? Kulam shavim litova, that she was 100 years, 20 years, a beautiful talk you should listen to. But Rav Soloveitchik basically says that Sarah had the innocence and the greatness of a child and the maturity of adult all the time throughout her life. She was a precocious youngster, like an adult, but she retained her childhood innocence as she aged, which is very hard for people to do. So, and the Rav says, as a youngster, we can daven, and in older people, we can learn, because the mindset is very different. But the idea of prayer is total dependence on God. And apparently what the Gemara is saying, or what the rabbis are saying, is God made our imahot barren because he wanted to teach the founding mothers of our religion the importance of dependence on God. And that even what for many people is very basic, having children, for some people it's they don't have children. That's matter of fact, the Akedat Yitzchak explains that was the argument between Yaakov and Rachel when Rachel got all mad at Yaakov, give me children, Havali Banim. And Yaakov said, what, are you crazy? Who do you think I am? Hatachet Elohim Anochi. Basically, the idea is what's the value of a woman, that the Torah is coming to teach that even without children, a woman can do wonderful things. And whatever, there's, I just want to throw that out for food for thought. If you have any ideas, if anyone to chime in, you can. And I guess the best example, listen, the 20th century had many great rabbis who had no children, starting on the woman's side. Nechama Leibowitz, of course, were all her children. Her students are her children, but she had no children. The Lubavitcher Rebbe had no children. The Satmar Rebbe had no children. The Chazon Ish had no children. The Sridei Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg had no children. That's very, I don't know what to make of that, but just many of the great leaders of the 20th century had no children, and whatever. So, but we pray to God. We're dependent on God, and God decides what to do. So I know that's really sort of a different topic, but I figured tying into the parsha and tying into the notion of our tefillot, and that's what we always have to keep in mind. And it's that, by the way, that's what I think one of the reasons why prayer is so hard for us today. Besides, it's boring and repetitive, and it's the same thing. We don't always know what it means. We don't know what we're saying, and all the reasons. And we're tired of the 50 reasons why tefillah is hard. The other reason tefillah is hard because, thank God, we're lucky. It's good that it's hard. Most people, thank God, living today, even with COVID, even in the 21st century, life is a lot better than it was many other times lived. Or life, you don't want to live sometime else. And life is very good. People have a lot of money and they can travel and they do all kinds of wonderful things, the things we complain about. So it's hard to daven. God forbid, there's a war going on. It gets a lot easier to daven. So the fact that davening is hard is sort of is a good thing, because it means that life is going well. And as we said in the first class, the Ramban says if you don't have any needs, you don't have to daven. That's it. Davening is, you don't have needs, you don't have to daven. So in a certain sense, we should be happy, or we should look forward to not having to daven. Of course, rabbinically, we have to daven, and as Rav Soloveitchik said, everybody has needs. And if you don't realize you have needs, that's an even bigger problem, right? But okay, let's continue with Birchat HaTorah, unless anybody wants to say any comments and disagree with what I said. Bavakasha. Okay, so let's just stay, let's continue with a number of things. So I think I said I'm going to start with this amazing Gemara in the Dharm. So I'm going to share my screen for half a minute, just so everybody can see the Gemara inside. Sometimes, okay. So the Gemara says, everybody see it? Okay. The Gemara, this is a Gemara in the Dharm, you see 81a. I'm using the Sefaria, the William Davidson Talmud. Right, the owner of the Detroit Pistons. I think he passed away not long ago. He gave us a big belt staka. He was the owner of the NBA team. I don't know what else he owned, but anyways. So the Gemara wants to know, why is it common that the children of Torah scholars are not Torah scholars? And we can go through an entire list today. You often see dynasties in the Torah world, and that's not necessarily a good thing. But we can list off one after another great Torah scholars whose children were not great Torah scholars. Some children began a century ago, they all became non-observant. Mark Shapiro had pointed out pretty much the Soloveitchik family was the only, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik was the only gadol of his generation who kept all his children observant. You go through the gedolim of every one of them had siblings who were not observant, or many of them had kids, depending what era exactly when they were born. But there was a time when it was impossible. You could be the greatest Torah scholar, and you had children who became non-observant. But even if they remained observant, it was not common that the Torah, one's after the next. It doesn't just because your father's or your mother wasn't practical back then, but just because your father's a great Torah scholar doesn't mean you will be. So the Gemara says, "Shelo yamru Torah Yerushahi." People shouldn't say Torah. You're born into the right family, you'll be a Torah scholar. If you don't have that if you're not born into the right family, you won't be a Torah scholar. So unfortunately, that's not always true. We know that in Eastern Europe, if you had wealth or you had the right connections, you got a better education. But in theory, but the Gemara is saying the way it should be is Torah should not be an inheritance. So we don't want, so we want to show it has nothing to do with who your parents are. Everybody can acquire Torah on their own. Then the Gemara gives a second reason. Rav Sheshet says, this is amazing. We don't want the rabbis to become too powerful. His father was the head, and this for his son, and the grandfather. They're going to think they're running a dynasty. They own the yeshiva. It's going to be a family affair. So the Gemara doesn't want that. You can't have people in charge like that, running it as a private. They're a very powerful family. Our Marzutra says because that's what they did. This was a punishment, because they took too much power for themselves. Okay, the Gemara goes on, says a few things, but this is what for our topic. Ravina Mar she'ein mevarchim b'Torah tchila. So Ravina says, you know why Torah scholars often don't have children? Torah scholars, because they didn't say Birchat HaTorah. A very strange statement. What does that mean? And why is that so important to say Birchat HaTorah? And what's the connection between not saying Birchat HaTorah and not having children? So some people explain very simply, perhaps too simply, that what do we say in Birchat HaTorah? We pray that our children and our grandchildren, say Tza'enu, will be Yodei Shemecha Lamdei Torah Lishma. So a person who doesn't pray that his children shall be learned, so they won't be learned. Okay, a little bit. And then the Gemara goes on. This is the startling part. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Does anybody know where that's from? Anybody want to quickly say where that verse comes from? You can cheat in the English. When do we read it? Okay, on Tisha B'Av. This is the Haftorah of the morning of Tisha B'Av. Where we who's going to understand? So why is God doing this to us? Why is God punishing us with this terrible exile and destruction and pain and suffering and death and all these terrible things that were going on? So it says Allah Zvam at Torati. They left my Torah. So the Navi answered, they didn't follow the Torah. So I knew Lo Achluba. So but it says that they didn't follow the Torah. They didn't walk in the path. So what's that adding? They didn't say Birchat HaTorah. Wow. The temple was destroyed, exiled, Jewish people had to suffer. Among the reasons, we have many other Gemaras, but here, why is the exile happening? This is already from the Navi. It's not like the rabbis said the Torah, the Teit HaMikdash was destroyed because of Sinat Chinam. That's a rabbinic idea, that the Sinat Chinam. This is already a prophet. This is Yirmiyahu Hanavi. Okay, he didn't say, it's the rabbis interpreting what Yirmiyahu said. That's the point up. But still, the fact that they didn't say Birchat HaTorah, that's why God is bringing this horrendous suffering on the Jewish people. Anybody want to tell me what that is? So I don't know. We'll try to understand, but I don't have a great explanation. I remember being taught this in high school and stuff, but anybody want to say? Shoko. So David, Baruch Hashem, listen, that's amazing. David, it's almost Shabbos, so let me know when you have to leave, but thank you. The explanation I heard, that the father would tell the son, the rabbinate is such a difficult profession, they would tell the children, whatever you do, don't be a rabbi. That's maybe true, but how's that Shalom Birchu b'Torah b'Tchila? And we mentioned that's what Rav Moshe says. A terrible thing. People would say, "Don't do it's hard to be a Jew." Rabbi Riskin, when we had an interview, I think it's really one of the few times he sat down a number of years ago. My partner, when we found the Torah and Dr. Elliot Malamed, he interviewed Rabbi Riskin. I'm sure it's about 10 years ago. A fascinating interview about his life story. But he promised his mother, he got a scholarship to Harvard, and he ended up turning it down to go to YU. His mother wasn't exactly thrilled. And he promised his mother made him swear, okay, you can go to YU, but don't promise me you'll never be a rabbi. No, I don't know exactly what he did, but that's how life works. But I don't know that that's true. Why is that connected to Birchat HaTorah? Okay, but they didn't bless the Torah. They didn't say it's a wonderful life to be a rabbi. Okay, I like that. It's true. Being a rabbi, I don't think anybody can influence the Jewish community more than a rabbi can. What I would say, living in North America like I do, maybe it's a little different in Israel, sort of the pulpit rabbinate gives you a sort of an opportunity to get involved and influence so many ways. Okay, very good. The explanation I heard is Shelo Birchu Torah Tchila is Torah became an academic subject. Torah became, they didn't give Torah the same status as everything else. Remember what we're talking, in other words, we'll study Torah, but Torah, I teach in a high school, and most of the kids are not observant, and when there's a math test and a Talmud test, you can probably guess which one people are going to study for more, if they're a day apart. So I'm not even, I don't want to be critical of that. I get it, but in a sense, that's what the Gemara is saying, that you have to make Torah primary. Shelo birchu b'Torah tchila. That they didn't see it as a religious any different. You don't make, the question is, why don't we make a bracha when we study physics? That's an interesting question. Why we don't make, no, Mark Shapiro in his book wrote that question to Dr. Lamb. He asked Dr. Lamb, and Dr. Lamb gave an answer. The answer is not so clear. If you believe physics, we believe, for those of us, I assume most people here believe in the importance of science, not just as science, but as the revelation of God, as a way to come closer to God, to understand God as part of God's creation. God is the creator of nature, is a God of nature, the God of revelation. So when we study physics, that's how I was taught. I was brought up. I remember Rav Tabori in high school teaching us, we believe that when you learn mathematics, that's also that's a fulfillment of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. It's a little slightly different than, classical Talmud Torah, but that too is included in the rubric of Talmud Torah. So, but nonetheless, we don't make a bracha on that. But the idea is that physics is important, but it's not quite Talmud Torah. So that's the explanation I heard, but I don't know exactly. But what you do see is the Talmud puts extreme importance to saying Birchat HaTorah in the morning. I've always complained is not the right word. I suggest, if I was the rabbi of a shul, I would recommend that the chazan in the morning starts with Birchat HaTorah. In other words, you come to shul and the chazan starts, now we've discussed, originally we started Baruch Shamar or your Yishabach, because that used to be said at home. Birchat HaShachar was said at home. When you got dressed and when you put your shoes on and when you washed your hands, you made all those brachot at home. But people didn't know what to do exactly. So we've transported it to the shul, and when you come to shul, we transport to the siddur and the chazan gets up. Why doesn't the chazan start at Birchat HaTorah? And according to, it's not apparent in that Gemara, but we discussed it when we gave the shir in Hazinu, Kishem Hashem Ekra Havu Godel Eloheinu. When we call out on God's name, Kishem Hashem Ekra, give greatness. And the rabbis derive from here, and many assume it's a biblical law. The Talmud has all discussion that one must say Birchat HaTorah. It's beside Birchat HaMazon is the only one clearly mentioned in the Torah, and the second one, perhaps, if there is another bracha that's mandated from the Torah, it's Birchat HaTorah. Every other bracha we make on food, when we light candles, any time we make a bracha, it's all very nice, very beautiful. The rabbis say we should make 100 blessings a day. A minimum of 100 blessings a day. They're all rabbinic. None of them are biblical mitzvot. So why this one that probably is a biblical mitzvah don't we say it loud? So probably the simple reason, because people went to Daf Yom Shir before davening. People were learning before davening. So if you learn before davening, you're not supposed to learn without saying Birchat HaTorah. Right, that's what David Eisen is pointing out. Birchat HaTorah is essential. People couldn't learn before. Right, the problem is the people who learn before know to say Birchat HaTorah in advance. If the people who aren't learning it. I don't know. I would like to take a survey, but I know, if I can use that not everybody who says Birchat HaShachar says Birchat HaTorah. It's not, it's not so important. That's the stuff at the beginning of the Siddur, especially if you show up late to shul. If it was really important, you'd say it out loud. That's what I've often said. I know totally different, but I've said whatever the argument, whether you should say a bracha on Halal on Yom Ha'atzmaut Whatever, there's a reason to argue, not relevant for now. But I feel in today, and you go to a shul and you don't make a blessing on halal, it means it's not important. Jews understand if you don't say out loud a bracha, it's not important. That's why the rabbis say Yontiv Sheni. Yontiv Sheni, for those of us who live here. So Yontiv Sheni is really only a minhag. It's only a custom. That's what the Gemara says. Hizar b'minhag avotecha. Be careful in the customs, even if it's a little rabbinic decree. So the assumption is you do not make a bracha. We know we do not make a bracha on customs. Make a bracha. So we shouldn't really make kiddush on Yontiv Sheni. But the Gemara says, if you don't make Kiddush and Yontiv Sheni, people are going to consider it a total joke. No one's going to take it seriously. Already, people sort of look down, especially today, and especially people go to Israel, like Yontiv Sheni already is like half the world doesn't keep it. That doesn't make any sense. So already people are degrading it. So it's very important to say brachot. So I think the reason doesn't really apply anymore. For those who learn, let them say Birchat HaTorah in advance. And for those who don't learn, I think the chazan should start Birchat HaTorah. But that's my craziness. If you want to ask your rabbi what they think about that idea, I'd be curious to hear what people have to say. But I really mean that in all seriousness. I think it would be the way our community is structured today, maybe in a different climate. It's different. Maybe in many shuls in Israel or in the yeshiva, it's different. But when people are come to shul, they say whatever it says in the siddur. They don't know what the chazan starts here. That's the important part. Maybe we should say it out loud. But Birchat HaTorah is very important. Okay, enough of that. Now, just one other point, and then I want to point out a couple other. What follows? We know we say Birchat HaTorah only once a day. We discussed this idea before, I think, in other contexts. You eat an orange at 9 o'clock in the morning and you eat an orange at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you make a separate Borei Pri Eitz. So why don't we say Birchat HaTorah every time we learn? Every time we eat, you have to wash again, you have to make another bracha. So why don't we say, and it would make a lot of sense, Birchat HaTorah, blessing God. So whenever I learn, I say Birchat HaTorah, and we're going to see, we learn right here in the Siddur. The Siddur was composed in a beautiful way, so we can fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah through the Siddur. It's not prayer, but the Siddur encompasses much more than prayer. So you have learning because we said a bracha, so now we're going to learn right after the bracha. But so why not do that all the time? And why not say, okay, you go to a shiur at lunchtime, go learn, go say Birchat HaTorah. Does anybody want to throw out an answer?
People have in mind that they're going to be learning later?
I have in mind I'm going to eat an orange later. Is that going to help?
No.
It helps if I'm going to eat it in 20 minutes. That it does help. If I'm going to eat it in 3 hours, it doesn't help.
But people talk Torah in their casual conversations. So
do they really? Everybody? Yeah, everybody talks Torah in their casual. I mean,
something comes up and they say, I heard this, or do you do this, or whatever it is. So
that's why I'm jealous of you. I think that's wonderful that you live in a community where this comes up. I mean, I try to do that too sometimes, but that's beautiful. But I don't know that it's true for most people. Anybody else?
Yeah,
I was saying, yeah.
Maybe we're expected to be learning all day long.
No, we're not expected to be learning all day. That for sure not. I mean, it's a very nice thing you say, but that's a modern invention that people learn all day, especially in the Talmud, and especially in the Rambam. Maybe today there's a reason for kol. I'm not going to have that discussion necessarily now. It's an important discussion, but even if you were right that you're supposed to learn all day, but you aren't learning all day. He's not doing what he should do, he or she. So why don't they make a bracha? Yes.
You could also say that.
Yes, but what you said that often we learn physics, for instance, we're learning it's like a manifestation of the universe.
That's the answer.
Realizing it, but learning physics.
Excellent. You come to my shiur on a regular basis. You picked up my right. So I think you're saying that. Listen, maybe your answers are better. My answer is you are learning Torah all day. A Jew is learning. Who was saying before? I'm sorry. Sprint, you were saying before you have to learn all day. You do have to learn all day, but you don't have to learn all day classical text. You learn physics all day. You learn how to be an honest businessman all day. Basically, what I like to say is when you learn Torah, you're learning theoretical physics. And when you go to work, you're learning applied physics. Maybe it's not physics, maybe it's an MBA program, but whatever you're doing. In other words, the whole essence of Judaism is to apply Torah to your day-to-day activities. So every moment when I'm practicing as a lawyer, an investment banker, a doctor for sure. In other words, there's certain professions that the act of being a doctor is a mitzvah. The act of being in business is not a mitzvah per se, but it's the mitzvah. First of all, you have opportunities, how you treat your employees, how you advertise, your competition, how you pay people, you're honest, all that, and then opportunity to make a kiddush Hashem, and of course making a living, all those things. So even if it's not medicine or helping a psychologist, helping somebody mental health issues, still even the businessman where it's just making money, that's also that's applied Torah. So I think it's a beautiful idea that the Torah, you make a bracha in the morning and I open up a daf Gemara, and if I don't open up a Gemara, many people, the assumption is, believe me, many people are going straight from davening to work. Many people, matter of fact, you look in the Mishnah, many people daven at work. In other words, the Mishnah has a whole discussion saying Kriyat Shema on top of a tree. People went to work. It's not like today, leisure time, weekends, long weekend, Mondays off. That was, why are you crazy? Even Shabbos was a revolution. People worked from crack of dawn. That's the Gemara assumes. People work from the crack of dawn till nightfall. You couldn't work at night. Night was very, very, back then, night you went to bed. But so they went to bed early. They got up early. They got up at the crack of dawn. They went to work. So when are they going to daven? So you know what? You're not going to daven so much. I don't think we discussed this yet in this class, but we should. The Gemara says, the Mishnah and Brachot says, you don't come down from the tree. How can I take time from my boss? I'm hired. I get paid a salary. I put in an honest day's work. I'm going to daven for an hour. Very nice. Daven an hour in your own time. Don't be your own boss. You work for somebody else. You can't daven for an hour. Can't go to minyan. You have time. You have to work. So the Gemara says, okay, you have to say Shema. The assuming it's a Jewish employer. Okay, you can say Shema. But say Shema at the top of the tree. You don't have to come back from picking oranges. You don't have to go down to the bottom. That's what the Gemara says. Shmon Esrei is different. Amidah needs more kavanah. But so people didn't sit and learn. This is we're so wealthy today. What I was saying before, we have Baruch Hashem. We have the opportunity. We all know. I'm from the generation where most of my friends, their parents, anybody went through the Holocaust, obviously, but even people who didn't go through the Holocaust. I've often quoted people. I'm sure here have heard me say, my mother, at 11 years old. She was born in 1933, my mother. And she was 11 years old, and they told her, you've learned everything a Jewish woman can ever have to know. You want to learn more, marry a rabbi, which is what she did. But that was it. Learning what opportunities are higher education. That was all unheard of. So people went to work right away, even before they happened, but they were dubbed. That's why the Siddur includes learning. We're going to see in a moment, because they have to learn a little bit. And then where it says you say Shema, it's also learning. And David pointed out before, it's true. If you say Ahava Rabbah, you don't have to go back and say Birchat HaTorah, but that's not the ideal. In other words, you should say Birchat HaTorah. That's if you didn't say Ahava Rabbah. But I think the answer is because you may not be learning in the classical sense, but there's a lot to learn. You can teach a lot by being an honest businessman. I've said 100 times, I guess I like this example because I used to be a big baseball fan, now a little bit less, but I've said how Sandy Koufax did more for Yiddishkeit than 1,000 rabbis. On Yom Kippur of 1965, not pitching. No rabbis like Drasha had more impact on people than Sandy Koufax, a totally non-observant Jew who didn't pitch in the first game of the World Series. That's unbelievable. So you have an opportunity in the business world, and for sure in the sports world, and anybody who reaches a celebrity status has an opportunity to really. You're a politician. You have an opportunity to be.
But that's the difference also between the bracha of Birchat HaTorah and Lasoka Divrei Torah. Lasoka Divrei Torah includes all of the things that you just said too, and that's why we say both of the brachos. One over actual learning Torah, the other one Lasoka Divrei Torah is devoting our lives to Torah, and everything we do in our lives is done in a Torah-dic way.
Right, but as we mentioned at the beginning, in the Talmud, these two brachot were options. You said one or the other. Later I said, they're all nice. Let's say them both. So it's really, that's not how they historically developed. And then I think I mentioned last week, many of the commentaries say la'asok b'divrei Torah, which is much more involved in study, the give and take, engage. We discussed that last week. The businessman, you're really more Torah. That's the oral Torah. Asher bachar banu mikol amim v'natan lanu et Torah, that's the written Torah. So it's blessings on both the written and the Torah. Torah, absolutely, you reach, you're saying be engaged, everything should be. But I'm saying what my point is, when you're working in the business world, you're applying the message of, you should be applying the message. Otherwise, it's bracha levatala. If you say Birchat HaTorah and you go and you cheat in business, and the Birchat HaTorah is a bracha levatala, maybe you shouldn't say the bracha because you're not living up to the ideals of the Torah. I remember many years ago, 15 years ago, when Torah Motion in the pre-Zoom days. So Rabbi Saul Berman, who was at that, I hope he's well. But he was, the head of Jewish studies at Stern, served for a while at Rabbi in Lincoln Square. So he spoke at a program we did in Toronto. And I remember him speaking on this issue, Shmon Esrei. He said, he was talking about the disjointedness that many people feel between their religious life and their quote unquote secular life. And he said I guess he was promoting, I said, sort of the modern Orthodox lifestyle, if I can use that term, where he was saying that if you see physics, as we're discussing, to pick on physics, if you see that as a manifestation of God's creation and a way of Talmud Torah, so then when you go to work in your physics labs, there's no disconnect between your religious life and your work. It's all one. It's a wholesome life. It's everything works together. But if you're trained that somebody said before, which some people are, that we're saying that the learn. The ideal Jew sits and learns. Rahman al-Islam, you didn't marry a rich girl and you got to go earn a living and you got to leave Kola. No, what can we do? You're going to have to go. So then when every day you're working, it's like Nebuch, I'm like a failure. I couldn't learn Torah all day. So it creates a disconnect. And then I don't want to, it makes it easier to sort of somehow, this is not my Torah world. I observe Torah in the base medrash and shul. The working world's like a very b'diavad. I really shouldn't be here. What can I do? So it's divorced from Torah. And then it leads to all kinds of things. Anyways, hopefully I'm paraphrasing him right. I think there's a lot there in what he's saying. Right? The idea of Birchat HaTorah once a day, in my mind, as I understand it, is this idea that everything we do is Birchat HaTorah. Sometimes it's with the Daf Gemara, and sometimes it's in a physics labs, and sometimes it's in a boardroom. Not in the Rogers boardroom, what's going on now. That's the Sinat Chinam. Those who live in Canada know what I'm talking about. The largest telecom company here. But anyways, but that's really what. Okay, let's move on. Unless anybody has any questions or comments about that. As we say it once a day. Okay. I just point out, and I think this also ties in, Baruch Ata Hashem, Notena Torah, Bracha Rabbanim Mikol Amim. That's the bracha we say, of course, when we get an aliyah. And it's thanking God for giving us Torah. Thank God for giving us Torah, but of course it's in the present. This again is a well-known idea, but it's as the Mesilat Yesharim writes, the most important things are the obvious things. It was interesting. This morning, on the way back from Minyan this morning, I daven now. I drop my kid off at school. I daven in school with him. That's where I teach. I have to go back and teach after this class. So I was listening to something to a shiur in the car. It's a 5-minute drive, but whatever. I was listening, and so the speaker, I won't mention his name, was saying how he never repeats. He tries never to repeat a shiur. And I remember somebody else once spoke for us. I won't mention his name either. And he had a pinch hit. And so he got up and he apologized. He said, I once gave the shiur like 3 years ago somewhere else, but I assume nobody was there. I'm going to give a shiur. So I went over and said, why are you apologizing? What's the big deal? Especially since you have 5 minutes. I said, if you want to accomplish anything, like if you want to make an event, you have to say the same thing over and over again. Any CEO of any company, any marketing firm knows that. You can't make a message once. If you want to teach Torah, you got to teach. You maybe say it in different ways. Don't repeat it, exact same thing, but obviously it's the same ideas over and over. That's the only way you influence people. I think that's very important. There's nothing to be embarrassed about that. I said this 6 months ago. Who remembers? I don't remember half the time what I say. So, it's very important. So he explained to me, and it was a very interesting insight. He said to me, that's the difference between a Rosh Yeshiva and a rabbi. This person was a Rosh Yeshiva, I guess, and he said he said, a Rosh Hashiva is like, I want to do new insights into Chidushei Torah, new insights. I'm not interested in repeating. I'm interested in developing, learning, and whatever. If I have something, I'll share it with people. I don't have to go over it again. A rabbi wants to influence people, want to create a community. So there you have to say the same message over and over again. But it's used, unfortunately, for negative things, and propaganda, demagogues, but it's used for positive things. You want to get a message across. So anyways, but the Mesilat Yesharim, the classic work of what became the classic work of Jewish ethics by the Ramchal, Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, the optometrist, because they wanted to burn all his books. I mentioned that before, I think, right? They put him into Cherem, basically, because he was into Kabbalah. He was young, he was unmarried, he was doing all kinds of crazy things, and they wanted to burn his books, and they burned his books, they got rid of it, and somehow the Mesilat Yesharim escaped, and they managed to save that. I don't know how, and because of that, most people who study the Mesilat Yesharim do not know that. So I think he became an optometrist. He died a young man. The Ramchal, I think then he went to Italy and whatever. It's anyway, so he writes in his introduction there that I'm not saying anything new. Everything I'm going to say, everybody knows. But that's the most important thing to say. You want people to improve, you got to say what people know. And they say that the comment, I think they said in the name of, I forget now who they said, maybe it was the Vilna Gaon, but I figure that doesn't make sense historically so much. But said that's the biggest insight, he said. That's not true. Everything he writes is new. It's how you say it. But anyway, back to their story with that. Birchat Hashem noten HaTorah. The Torah is given in the present tense. That bracha. It's not Natan HaTorah. We're not thanking God that he gave us the Torah. We're thanking God he gives us the Torah. B'chol yom yu beinecha kachadashim. Every day the Torah should be like you knew. So that means there should be a freshness to Torah, which, it's all boring. New, everybody. New Coke didn't work, but normally people like new and exciting. Old boring, that's the old fashioned. We like this, especially today, technology, everything is changing. Noten HaTorah, but it means we should view Torah with vigor and excitement, like something new and exciting, but it means really more than that. It means, more importantly, I would say, it means that Torah has to be applied in every generation. That Torah, we discussed this in the past, right? How Chazal, how a Sanhedrin has the right to reinterpret the Torah. A Sanhedrin can come along and say they're not 39 malachot on Shabbos, they're only 24 or they're 56, so they can do whatever they want. They have to keep Shabbos, because that says in Torah how to keep Shabbos. So the rabbis have a derivation how they got the 39 melachot. It's not halacha l'Moshe Messina. That's not from Moshe. It's not cast in stone. It's cast in stone today. That's why we discussed. It's revolutionary to say this today, but that's aleph beit in how a Sanhedrin works. That we mentioned, I think even like last week, that's why the Rambam only counts mitzvot that are directly mentioned in Torah. Something that's derived from Torah, no, that he doesn't count. That's not, because that can change in theory. It can't change today, but it can change in theory. So just the idea of noten HaTorah, that God gives us the Torah every day. It should be new and fresh, but also we have to apply it. And believe me, that's the greatest challenge the Jewish people have been dealing with since the late 1700s. It's the challenge of Reform, Orthodox, Conservative. They're all addressing the same issue. The issue was, how does Judaism apply in the modern world? So Reform came along and said we have to reform Judaism. And the Chatam Sofer said we have to reform our society. We're not going to reform Judaism. Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. And and Shimshon Raphael Hirsch came along and said, no, we're going to do combined Torah and Derech Eretz. Whatever we're going to do. Everybody's struggling with the issue of how to apply Torah in the modern world. What do we do with LGBT? We have a totally different attitude than what appears in the Torah. Things change. How do we apply Torah? What can we reinterpret? What can we, depending how observant, okay, we're not bound by Torah. Those who are bound by Torah, we consider ourselves bound by Torah. We can't just say I don't like it. So what do? How do we re-understand it, reinterpret? How do we deal with the Israeli society where the majority of the population is not religious? And how do we keep Shemitah, that it's not just for us, but it works for the country? So all these questions, that's the question of Judaism for the last 250 years. How do we engage with the modern world? So ignoring the modern world is also a form of, okay, I'm going to disengage from the modern world. Okay, Is that going to work? So but I don't believe, I think that's not what Torah is meant to be. Torah is meant to be so we can go from the base measures to the physics labs and make a Kiddush Hashem and apply. So it's Noten HaTorah. The Torah is ever present. The Torah is ever changing, right? I think it was Jonathan Sachs's Yortzeit, I believe, is on Monday. I believe the first Yortzeit of Jonathan Sachs is on Monday, if I'm not mistaken. So it was before he was famous, when I was like 30 years ago, before he was even the chief rabbi, I think, I read a book of his, and it was very interesting. It was I forget what it's called. I have it sitting on my in my bookshelf here. I'll take a look. It was about what 4 kids come home at the Pesach Seder, and each kid is very different. And this one, was living on a kibbutz in Israel, and this one's in yeshiva. Like the kids come home for Pesach Seder, 4 different kids, of course, and the whole discussion. And I remember, or you would think it's in that book, that Jonathan Sachs defined halacha. I use this, the difference between Torah and halacha. Torah is ever changing. I'm sorry, Torah is never changing. Torah is eternal. That's the base. Torah is eternal. God's eternal. God is, gave us a wonderful gift, can never change. The Torah itself. What's halacha? Halacha is the application of Torah to modern life. That's what halacha is. Modern life always changes. So therefore, the Torah is always changing. In other words, the Torah, halacha is the intersection between a never-changing Torah and an ever-changing modern life. The result of that intersection between these two important ideas is halakha. How do we live in the modern world? How do we walk? What's our path that we're going? What's the path? That's what halakha means. What's the path? We combine eternal Torah and ever-changing society. So the Torah doesn't change, but of course it changes. In other words, the halakha changes, how we apply Torah. So that's, I think, the meaning of Noten HaTorah. Okay, anybody, please feel free to disagree with me, right? David Eichmann in the Raka was only 39, right? I think I said he was a young man, right? Oh, he was an Akko when he died. Okay, thank you very much. I'll take a look later on. Okay, now let's discuss what happens after Birchat HaTorah. So we have 2 fascinating things, 2 cycles of learning. Basically, what happens next in the Siddur is we say, Yivarechecha Hashem Yishmerecha. Well, I don't know if we'll get there in today's class, but why we pick that, Birchat Kohanim. Then we say, Elu Dvarim She'en Lehem Shiur. That's the first Mishnah in Peah. These are the things that don't have any measures. Hold on, I got a glass of water. Give me half a second. Okay, sorry. Thank you. And then we say, these are the things that we eat the fruit in this world, but the reward is the next world. That's a Gemara. That's the passage in Shabbat 127a. If we'll get time, or next week, maybe I'll show you inside. So what do we have? We have verses in the Torah. We have something from the Mishnah, and then we have something in the Talmud. And then 2.5 minutes later, we're going to do the exact same thing, but a lot longer.
Give me 2-gallon baggies from the pantry.
I'm sorry. Oh, no. That I thought that was the question, but I'll just, okay. So that we have Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. Then we say Birchat HaShachar, we'll get to Al-Kain Neshama, and then I don't know how many people say it, we skip it, whatever. Then we say Korbanot. So we say basically the Korban Tamid, right? We say all the Korbanot, focusing on the daily sacrifices. That's our psukim in the Torah. That's a direct quote from the Torah. Then we quote the Mishnah, Ezem Akoman. We'll come back to all of this, why we do it, right? This fifth parak in Zvachim. I don't know how many people say this every day. You don't have to raise your hand. It's pretty long, and it's the stuff that people skip. They mumble. Maybe the old men used to say that, right? That's right. It's pretty. You say a whole chapter of Mishnah, and then you say Rabbi Yishmael. That everybody says, because every shul, even whatever they skip, they go to Rabbi Yishmael. It's the exact same thing. It's the verses in the Torah about sacrifices, Mishnah, Ezem Akoman, and then Rabbi Yishmael, the way to interpret the Torah. That's a Talmudic passage. It's actually in the Sifrei, in the introduction to Vayikra, but it's what we call Talmud. Talmud doesn't mean what's printed in the Babylonian Talmud. That's not the Talmud. Is a matter. It's an analysis and debate and discussion and deduction. That's what Talmud is. Mishnah is straight halacha. Mishnah means do this, do that, light Hanukkah candles one day. Okay, good, Mishnah, no discussion. Well, look, I can argue, I can learn from this. That's already Talmud. Deduction, analysis, questioning, Talmud. Talmud is a method of thought, which is why you have the Talmud talking about Talmud, even though the Talmud didn't exist. In other words, it's a way of thinking. So we have two cycles of learning, so to speak, in our Siddur. And what the scholars say, it is one developed in Babel and one developed in Eretz Yisrael. And when they put the Siddur together, they merged them like a lot of things. The Siddur is a story of Jewish history. So we have two models that after you say Birchat HaTorah, you have to learn. So and what do you learn? So it's very interesting. We learn Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud. So we learn the biblical text, then we learn straight halacha with no analysis, and then we analyze it. So that's based on a Gemara. That's based on a well-known Gemara in Kiddushin. I didn't print it out, but I have to put the source up and whatever, that Lo'olam Yishalei Shadam, a person should always divide his learning into thirds. He should do a shlish, 1/3 Torah, 1/3 Mishnah, and 1/3 Talmud. So the Gemara says, well, how do you know how long you're going to live? You should do like the first 20 years, this 20 years, how long you're going to live. So in other words, why is the Gemara asking that? The sort of, well, what do you mean, Avi? Who says it's 20 years, 20 years, 20 years? Because it's a progression. In other words, you can't really know Mishnah if you don't know the Psukim in Chumash. And maybe that you know a little bit, but you for sure can't know Gemara well unless you know Mishnah. The Mishnah and Pirkei Avot, please God, we'll get there next summer. When you're 5, you study Mikra. When you're 10, you study Mishnah. When you're 15, you study Talmud. Because it's like mathematics. You can't start in Talmud. That's a huge educational error that that's very common today. Unfortunately, the Maharal, I mentioned the Maharal was very much wanted to go back to that old system. So it's a building block. So therefore, the Talmud assumes, okay, learn X years to like know Tanakh backwards, 9 to 9, do it 5 times with Rashi, Radak, whatever, 9 to 9. Then no Mishnah is Balpet. This spend 10 years in Mishnah. You have to figure out how many years do I have to learn. Let's say I'm going to learn in Kola for 10 years, so I'm going to do 3 1/3 years Mikra, 3 1/3 years Mishnah, and your Talmud. So that's what the Gemara said. But you don't know if you're going to be in Kola for 10 years. Maybe your father-in-law's business will go bankrupt, earlier. Whatever. Maybe he'll he'll invest in Amazon. You can learn for 20 years in Kola, whatever, right? So you don't have to like my sense of humor. That's okay. Then you don't know. So that's where the Gemara asked the question, like, what were they thinking? Because it's a building block. So the Gemara said, no. We don't mean 3 years. We mean every week, whenever you learn. So every week you go to 5 shiurim or 6 shiurim, do 2 and 2. Do anybody do that? You know anybody who does that? So that's what the Gemara says. Bishinantam, bishilashtam. That's the Gemara has a play on words. You should divide your learning. So this is famous. I meet people. Rabbeinu Tam, the grandson of Rashi, he didn't like this Gemara apparently, or he reinterpreted this Gemara. Noten HaTorah. In our time, he reinterpreted this Gemara. He said that today Talmud Bavli, when you learn Talmud, you learn everything. That's become the common Ashkenazic practice of learning. You don't have to learn anything. Everything's in the Talmud. The Talmud quotes verses. Now, the Talmud assumes you're going to look up the verse and see it in context. That's a problem. People don't do that. And the Talmud has a Mishnah. In our printed Talmud is a Mishnah. So you learn Talmud, you got everything. And then he makes this wild claim, Talmud Bavli. What does the word Bavli mean? Somebody, it's not a hard question, I think. What does Talmud Bavli mean? What does the word Talmud Bavli mean?
Mixture.
Very good. Very good. Okay. I was hoping you'd say the Babylonian Talmud. It's made in Bava, which is what it means. So Rabbeinu Tam comes with this new idea of Balul. It's mixed in. The Talmud Bavli, of course, it's like a joke. I mean, I don't mean a joke. It's like funny almost, but it's not what the Talmud Bavli means. But he's whatever. I assume Rabbeinu Tam knew you wouldn't take him 100%, seriously. I can't believe he meant it as a serious comment. But he said like Mina Shemaim, Mina Shemaim, it must be the word Babel can be read with Balul mixed up. So everything is mixed in the Talmud Bavli. So therefore we can learn only Talmud. That's what Rabbeinu Tam says. Nope. Maybe for Rabbeinu Tam, I'm not commenting on that. We'll comment later. I guess I already did comment on that. But that's why the practice in the Siddur is to learn Mikra, Mishnah, and Talmud, because that's what the Talmud says. Rabbeinu Tam is living only in the 12th century. Rabbeinu Tam was born. Rabbeinu Tam was very young. He was like 5 years old when Rashi died. He didn't really know his grandfather. The Rashbam, his older brother, knew Rashi. The Rashi dies in 1105. So the Rashbam was probably born around, I don't know, 1080. I don't know exactly. Rabbeinu Tam was probably born around 1100. And Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam lived at the same time, but it's like they lived in two different worlds. I mean, it's interesting. The Tosfots never quote the Rambam, as far as I know. And it's, believe me, it's not that I went over every Tosfot, but from what I've read, never. So the Balei Tosfot ever quote a Rambam. It was very different. It was a whole different style of learning. The Tosfot, I mean, read Chaim Soloveitchik's articles. You know, Tosfot revolutionized. This is just one of his revolutions. Tosfot revolutionized how we study Talmud. The whole and the number one chiddush, I would say, if you don't know anything about Tosfot, you want to sound, you know, like I know something. What the biggest innovation of the Tosafists, 12th to 14th century, Germany, France, was that the entire Talmud is one unified work. That was a tremendous, you know, chiddush. Rashi doesn't know from that. In other words, the Talmud often contradicts itself. I don't contradict itself. Has different, discusses the same topic in different places and comes to and says different things. So Rashi is never bothered by those questions. When he learns it in Brachot, he learns it one way. He learns it in the Darim. He learns it. He explains the Gemara in its place. This Gemara contradicts that. I go, so what? So what? The Gemara is 500 years of Jewish, you know, learning, hundreds of scholars. We know people disagree all the time. What's the big deal? So the Gemara in Bava Metzia and the Gemara in Bava Kama disagree with each other. Who cares? So Rashi never addresses the issue. Tosfot came up with this new idea. I mean, he didn't say it, but it's obvious. How can you say this? The Gemara over here says that. So Tosfot then, this Gemara means this, and this Gemara means that. So he created new wild interpretation, and we don't think that way because we're just trained. So that became the Tosfot did revolutionize. In other words, his system became very much in vogue. But the basic chiddush, which you can question, I don't think today anybody can question that. If you question that, you'd be considered a heretic. But what Tosfot proposed basically was the entire Talmud, the 63 tractates or the 37 tractates we have Gemara on, is all one. It's all one. And if there's a contradiction, we have to resolve. So sometimes they can't be resolved. Sometimes they'll say, what can we do? This Gemara, they disagree. But 95% of the time, Tosfot will find the resolution. I'm saying he made it up, but they said this Gemara is only referring to this case, and this Gemara is referring to that case. So that's Tosfot. So Tosfot changed the whole style of learning. Talmud becomes everything. So this division between Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara it no longer really is done today. Although there's good reason, at least in I would say in high school, at least in elementary and high school. I think it would be very smart that no Jewish school should have Gemara, unless your kid has a genius. But no genius belongs in school anyway; it doesn't learn anything in school. But for normal kids, that's 90% of people, right? 80% of people think they're above average, right? That obviously that's impossible. But right, everybody thinks they're above average. So, but for the average kid, the 90% of kids, nobody should be opening up a Talmud until they're 15 years old. Let them learn Tanakh and let them learn Mishnah. And then when they open up the Gemara, they'll go 20 times faster than they could have. But anyways, so that's that. Okay, so now let me just introduce one thing, and I see it's already getting late. Time flies when you're having fun. Okay, so we say Birchat Kohanim. Why do we say Birchat Kohanim? Okay, so we have to pick something, you understand, from the Torah. You have to pick something from Mishnah. We have to pick something from Gemara. Yivarach Hashem Yishmerecha. Birchat Hashem Notein Torah. Yeah, you ever wonder why every day you say Birchat Kohanim? Anybody? So I will give two brief answers, and maybe we can pick up here next week, and you can tell me. Believe me, I never thought of this question until I started preparing this year either. So, like I said at the beginning, I really want to thank you. This year is when I've learned the most in many, many years of preparing for a shiur. I mean, I always learn when you prepare for a shiur, but since most people, myself included, almost never study the Siddur. Yeah, I've read here, and of course I read the Rav Soloveitchik, but to really, go through 10 books, whatever, try to research. So I've learned so much. So I really have to thank you for that ability, but I never really thought about it. Why do we say Birchat Kohanim? So
That's the every day in the temple, the Kohanim bless
yes,
them.
that's true. That's true. So you could say that we discussed that prayer is really temple centered in our first class. Prayer emanates from the Beit Hamikdash, Beit Tefillot. That's what God says. It's a place of prayer. And there was a mitzvah to do Birchat Kohanim every day, which they do in Israel. It's very unclear. Nobody has a good reason why we don't do it in Chutz La'aretz. I think the Sephardic community does, but we don't do it in Chutz La'aretz. It's very unclear why. So that could be because Birchat Kohanim was said in the temple, and we're sort of replicating the temple a little bit in our Siddur, especially the korbanot. We'll discuss next week why we say the korbanot. So that could be, what else? Anybody else want to suggest a reason? So I would say, okay, I'll suggest one reason, then maybe pick up another one. Because we're a mamlechet kohanim, v'goyim am kadosh. The idea of Birchas Kohanim is that we have to teach the world. In other words, I think perhaps maybe you don't like that reason, but I think it's the idea that all Jews are Kohanim, right? We're not all technically Kohanim, but we're all Mamlechet Kohanim, the Goy Kadosh. And the role of a Kohen was to teach Torah. Kisifte Kohen Yishmeru Dat, right? We've commented many times, right? Everybody thinks the Kohen sat in the Beit HaMikdash. Your typical Kohen worked in the temple 3 days a year. Every 24 weeks, he was on call, and he worked 1 day every 24 weeks. That was the beta. That was the system. You don't need so many Kohanim. The Kohen Gadol, he worked there. You had a permanent staff, and you had like in Miluim, I don't know how to, but you had like in Miluim every week, you had a different group of Kohanim, and then a different group of Jews who would go to Mamadot, who would go pray, really, who would, with them, and every week it changed. So you were on call every 24 weeks, but even 24 weeks, you didn't work every day. You worked 1 day in that 24 weeks, in that week. And so what did the Kohanim do? The Navi tells them, they taught Torah. They were the teachers of Torah. So we say Birchat HaTorah, and then we talk about the Birchat Kohanim, because the role of the Kohen is to teach Torah. And then not only the Kohen is the one who teaches Torah to the Jewish people. And then the Jewish people as Kohanim teach Torah to the whole world. Teach Torah. That's the idea of universal prayer. The temple, Beit Tefillah Yikarei L'chol Ha'amim, right? If it's because of the temple is a place of prayer, not just for Jews, for everybody. So that's a little bit, we have to pick up. It's getting late. So just let's quickly review what we learned a little bit. So we discuss God wants to hear the prayers of the righteous. That's why he made them akarot, barren. It sounds very harsh, and it's very but the idea that we're totally dependent on God, and that's the way to know it. Even they had to understand that idea and teach it to people. Also, we expressed the idea that even without children, somebody can make great contributions to the world. That even if someone's not, we shouldn't define a woman by her how many children she has. We define a woman by what she does, and not everybody is blessed by God to have children. And we discussed many people didn't have children. We discussed why we say Birchat HaTorah. We discussed the importance of Birchat HaTorah. The Talmud implies the temple was destroyed because we didn't say Birchat HaTorah. It's pretty wild. And we said, why could that be? So because they didn't take the Torah as seriously. They viewed it as an academic subject. It was like everything else, to where Torah has to have a special thing. And then we discussed the other views of Birchat HaTorah, why children, you have to pray for your children. And we don't want Torah to be only for certain families. You want Torah to be universal. So therefore, very often, it shouldn't be based on what family you're born. That's in the kingdom, but in the Torah, it should be based on who you are. And we discussed Notein HaTorah, that the Torah is being plural every day, and why we only say Birchat HaTorah once a day, because we learn Torah, we apply Torah when we go to our physics labs in the business or the sports field, wherever it may be. That's also Torah. It's not there's a divorce. It's not like we learn Torah. Okay, I go to work. I have to make a living. What can I do? And then I'll learn Torah. No. Going to work, that's part of your Torah life, and that will change everything. And then obviously then you realize what I'm doing in the business world, what I'm doing when I go to work is part of Torah. Therefore, I have to act in a particular way. And then we discussed, okay, after you say Birchat HaTorah, you have to learn Torah. The way to learn Torah is a three-tiered system: Tanakh, Mishnah, Gemara. And therefore, we have 2 of those cycles in or Siddur, where like they do that twice, once right away, once a little later, once a little bit longer, one is shorter, and then we discuss Rabbeinu Tam changing it. Okay, so I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you, and we look forward to learning with you, and invite your friends, this and others, and okay, so let me just see if there are any questions I quickly missed, and okay, explanation, Shalom Bacharbanu, with no separation. So disrespectful for the state and Ghana fellow citizens. I'm not quite sure what that means. iPad. Candle lady, yes, soon. I know it. Okay, I'll talk about. Good morning. I have a question anonymously. Okay, fine. Birchat HaTorah said in shul, prevent learning Torah, we discussed that. Okay. Tosfot said we're not meisich dat. Right, that's correct. We don't give our mind up from learning. Lasok b'dei Torah involved constantly. Correct. Oh, that's good. Lasok, right? You're involved. I don't know if it means lasok. It means we're engaged. Does it mean constant? Okay, could be. Thank you, Aviva. Agricultural societies had more downtime today. So, yeah, religious storytelling. That's part of the Shemitah. Part of the Shemitah to learn. You're right. But when they worked really hard. Listen, we know that historically most of the farmers in Israel were very ignorant. It wasn't like today. Rabbi Akiva before 40 was the norm. People didn't know how to learn. Okay, I also actually go teach in a few minutes back at chat. Okay, so next year is on Sunday morning. Next week we have all our 9 series going on, please God. So we look forward to learning with you. Watch the emails and invite your friends, and want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, and thank you very much, and be well, everybody. Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Hi, Faye. How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm doing well. Yourself?
Okay.
It's
Thank
good?
you. Thank
Good.
you.
Thank you for a
Okay.
great shiur.
Thank you
Shabbat
very much.
Shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.
Good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos, everybody. Yes.
Shabbos.
Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.